Tonight, you're here to hear about wilderness canoe tripping in Minnesota and Maine. You know, they seem pretty familiar. I have a friend in Maine, and we share our extreme weather forecasts with each other. Um, there's similar kinds of locations with forests and lakes and rivers, but the canoe cultures are really different. Scott's going to talk about his extensive paddling experiences in both states. Scott Oeth is the owner of Bull Moose Patrol, and he guides wilderness trips and teaches outdoor skills. Does a monthly pack and paddle radio show, and has a website. He's been involved in scouting for many years, and is also a Minnesota Master Naturalist. He presented to us last year about winter camping, and then I randomly discovered that he'd written this article about the wilderness canoe tripping culture differences, and so he's going to tell us about that. When he's not out on the trail, he runs his financial advisory practice. So Scott, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks for reaching out, Fran. It's fun to be back. I enjoyed the talk. I think it was probably about this time last year on winter camping and winter survival. And as we're chit-chatting before the presentation started, nothing I like more than talking about wilderness adventures. So this is fun for me. And this is home base for me. I live in the Twin Cities. I do a lot of my personal trips, my scout volunteering, and the trips I organize for Bull Moose Patrol and the classes. A lot of that is in this area, in the Twin Cities, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. Do a lot of long weekend type trips, but I do like adventuring further away. And a couple times a year, putting together a bigger, expedition type trip where we're going further afield. So I've led trips in the North Cascades backpacking. We've paddled in the Ozarks and Ontario and Alaska, the desert Southwest, all over the place. Really love it. One of the places that's really captured my heart is Maine. And I guess growing up in this region, I would read, see old LL Bean catalogs. Oh, the Baxter State this or that, or the Maine River Driver Long Johns or something like that. And it was kind of intriguing. And I love history, and I really like the history of outdoors. And for me, there's sort of an aesthetic appeal to the golden age of, outdoorsiness and whatnot. And so a lot of the older books were written closer to the population centers in the East Coast. There's a lot of stories in the old hunting and fishing magazines and old canoe journals and things like that about tripping in Maine. So it was always kind of interesting to me. But Fran, you kind of hit it on the head. Having made many trips there and spent a lot of time there, made a lot of friends, I really view Maine and Minnesota as sister states, especially the outdoor culture. So I kind of thought, well, of all these great places to go, you can go to the desert, you can go to the mountains, you can go to the Pacific Northwest. Why take a big trip a long ways away to a place that's a whole lot like Minnesota? Well, what happened is about 10 years ago, I had a trip planned up in Canada, and the people I was going with had to back out. I had the time already set aside. I was planning on doing a trip. I was looking around thinking, well, what should I do? I'm going to go do something myself. And there's a guide school in northern Maine that was running a river guide training trip that same time slot, basically. So I just shifted. I went out there. Thought, okay, I've always been kind of curious. And I spent a week out there, learned a lot of hardcore, hands-on, technical outdoor skills, spent a lot of time around the campfire with people out there, learned a lot about the culture, and just found that all that is true. Maine is quite a bit like Minnesota, especially Northeast Minnesota. But what I found is if you love Northeast Minnesota, if you love the boundary waters, you're really going to love Maine. And so it has been worth the trip for me. I've made many trips back, and there are also some significant differences. So I've given a presentation quite a few times. I forget how many times, probably a half dozen at Canoecopia, at Midwest Mountaineering, different places like that, talking about paddling Maine's wild rivers. One of my big passions. Yes, I love winter camping. I love diving into practicing survival skills, but wilderness canoe camping is really one of my big passions. And so I've done that several times. And then, like Fran mentioned, I participated in this article contrasting the technical points of what's different about canoeing in Maine versus Minnesota. And that was fun. So what my thought is for tonight is I'll kind of maybe give a quick tour through the presentation, where I've talked a lot about the different rivers and different types of trips in Maine, and then maybe spend a little bit of time also on that compare and contrast and what's different, because I've definitely learned things and I've picked up skills and techniques in Maine that I've brought home and I use and I incorporate here. And there's also things I've looked at and said, well, that works out there, but that would never work in the boundary waters. It would be a disaster, and vice versa. And so it's fun for me. I love being outdoors because I love being outdoors, and I really enjoy teaching and guiding people. But a big part of it for me also is I like the hard hands-on skills and the learning part of that. So, so let me, hopefully I can do this screen share here. I'm going to pull up my slideshow, see if that works. All right, so you all seeing paddling Maine's wild rivers? Very good. Okay, so, what was my inspiration? I mentioned a bit, old time outdoorsy type literature and books, L.L. Bean catalogs. There's a fellow named Bill Revere who actually worked for the U.S. Border Patrol. He was a Maine guide, kind of your classic old time outdoorsy type person, and he wrote the L.L. Bean Guide to the Outdoors that I received as a Christmas present back in, I don't know what, 1981 or something like that. And so I read that, learned a lot from that book. Teddy Roosevelt, interesting character to me. I was a history minor in college and had to do term paper, and I was trying to think of who, and Teddy Roosevelt was kind of interesting. I knew he's an outdoorsy guy and had done a lot as president, and so I spent a whole semester studying and diving in and wrote this big term paper on Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was born into a wealthy family and grew up on the East Coast, but he was a sickly child. He's asthmatic. He's very bookish. And his father, who he admired greatly, this very sort of powerful, forceful figure, said, you have the mind, you must make the body. And he really believed in, the strenuous life. And so his dad packed him up and sent him up to Maine and to live in the woods and try and, make a man out of him, kind of the old style. So it was very interesting to read about Teddy Roosevelt and Henry David Thoreau, started going to Maine in the mid 1800s and wrote the book in the Maine woods. And so those were some of the things. That first trip, nothing beats Minnesota for lake to lake paddling, the land of 10,000 lakes. We all know it's a lot more than that. Our beloved boundary waters, and those are wonderful canoe trips. I'd happily spend the rest of my life paddling the boundary waters, but I really, really like paddling on rivers. There's something about moving water, so going from point A to point Z, and learning the dynamics of the hull and eddies and currents and paddling techniques. And the more I did that, the more I craved it and found that, yes, paddling and portaging through the boundary waters is a wonderful experience, but man, there's something about the moving water. And I'm not necessarily a big adrenaline thrill junkie, but I love paddling rivers. And one of the things that's different, even though Maine looks a lot like Minnesota, we talk a bit about elevation going down to sea level, and they have better long rivers for paddling canoe trips, wilderness type canoe trips than Minnesota. So that was some of my initial trips. As I met more of the people there, I realized it's much more of a river paddling culture. I wanted to see the state. And part of that river paddling culture is the lost art of canoe poling. And, Stacy was just asking me if I was going to go to Canoecopia. One of the presentations I've done over and over, they keep asking me to come back, is on canoe poling. Canoe poling is a skill that has essentially died out in our region. A few people, me and like another guy and his brother, do this. That's about it. It is a died out, lost skill in the Midwest, which is a shame. So I'm doing my little part to try and bring it back. But there's still a handful of people in New Brunswick, Maine, Nova Scotia who have held on to this skill, and it's a highly refined art where you stand in the canoe and you use a long pole and you can push off the bottom to push yourself up through rapids and up against the current. And very importantly, you can use it to bring your canoe down through the river with great control. And you can stop, you can back up, you can move side to side, you can see much better, and you're using your entire body. And I really wanted, I was like, it almost seemed mythical. I'd see references to canoe poling and old outdoor literature. And so I wanted to see, is this doable? How do you do this? And how do you learn about it? And so that was some of my initial trips out here. Here's an old picture of Teddy Roosevelt with Bill Seawall and Wilmot Dow, his guides who his dad had hired. They spent a lot of time up in the Maine woods with when he was a young man. And there's a great book written by a Baxter State Park ranger called The President's Guide, and it's about William Seawall, who was just an absolutely remarkable character. He was a logger. He was an incredible woodsman. He was a sheriff of the county up there, so he didn't carry a gun. He had such powerful hands. He would just grip people in his vice-like grip and crush their wrist, and they couldn't get away. But Teddy Roosevelt wrote extensively about these two. He looked up to them and admired them so much and found incredible inspiration and just thought they were the ideal of what what he wanted to be like. And when he went out and started his ranch out in the Dakotas, he sent for these guys, and they came out and helped him build his cabins out there, chop down cottonwood trees and build his cabins out in the Medora area in the Dakotas. Henry David Thoreau, before Teddy Roosevelt, took trips, some very significant ones, pretty long trips up in the Maine woods. In the 1850s, he went with his Penobscot guide, Joel Polis, and did the Penobscot River and the Allagash and Chase Carey, and did a lot of tripping in that area. And it's said, I've read, that on his deathbed, 40 years later or something like that, when he's in New York City or Boston or wherever he was, as he was, slipping away, Henry David Thoreau's last words were moose and Indian. And the thought was that he's probably thinking back fondly to his trips up in the Maine woods with his Indian guides and seeing moose and living the life in the North Woods. Here's an interesting character who I find absolutely fascinating, Flyrod Crosby. And Flyrod was, boy, I should look this up. I'm forgetting her first name, her real name, but she was sort of an Annie Oakley type character from Maine. And the state of Maine, I think one of the things they did that was fairly smart is they recognized, hey, what do we have? They were very big in shipping and fishing and shipbuilding, and they had these incredible tall white pines that they'd make, mast for old sailing ships. Logging was huge. And they started to realize recreation is something we have that's a big, important part of our industry. And how can we promote our recreation and make sure that people have a good time, and that, these rich folks coming up from Boston and Philadelphia and New York don't get lost or hurt themselves. So they started the Registered Maine Guide program. And Bill Seawall and Wilmot Dow were Maine guides. It was more informal. It might be like what we have in Minnesota, say today. But the state started licensing and the Registered Maine Guide program in the late 1890s. And they chose Flyrod Crosby as their first Maine guide. So she was tall. I guess she was very striking. She was a great shot. She was an incredible outdoors person. She could paddle and pull a canoe. She could split wood, and she was a fantastic fly caster. And so there's great photos of these old time outdoor expos in Boston, and where they would go down and they'd set up an exhibit with a wall tent and a fake fire and, a dead deer and a moose laying there and, fish in the pan, and Flyrod would give demos on casting and splitting wood. And she's wearing her leather leggings. And I think she was about 6 feet tall or something like that. So she was really an ambassador for the state. And she was the first person in this program that helped start the legend and the lore of the Maine guide. So I think this is kind of interesting, comparing the two, because they are very similar. But I put this together, and I first put this together several years ago. I see 2015 down in the corner. So I have not fact checked it since then. Some of these things might be slightly different. Minnesota is a much larger state. We're the 12th largest. Maine is 39th. Both states have a lot of water, both big water. We're on the coast of Lake Superior. They have the famous rocky Maine coast in the Atlantic Ocean. And we have the Mississippi River and lots of other great rivers, and then the lakes. But you can see we're 7th in square miles of water. Maine is 12th, despite being a much smaller state. Coastline, about the same. Population, there's a lot more people. We're somewhere like 5.5 million people in population here in Minnesota. Wisconsin next door is about the same. Maine is about 1.3 million in population. And then these next ones, these are some of the points I think really kind of help start painting the picture. Our highest point of elevation, Eagle Mountain, 2,300 feet, and our low point, Lake Superior at 600 feet above sea level. Maine, the highest point is Mount Katahdin, so the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, 5,200 feet high. And what's the low point in Maine? It's sea level. It goes down to sea level. So higher highs and a lower low, and it's right on the maritime coast, which is very wet environment, very wet, very moist. Breezes and winds come in from the Atlantic, carrying in a lot of moisture, and they hit those high points, and they go down these fabulous long rivers. Forest cover. So you think Minnesota is a very woodsy state, and it is, but of course, one of the first things I learned doing the Master Naturalist course is the different biomes of Minnesota, and really we have a large part that's prairies and grassland. We have the hardwood southeast corner of the state, but our forest cover is about a third of the state, 28%, 29%, something like that. Maine, 85% of the state is forested. It's the most forested state in the nation. And I'll tell you, when you fly in there, you can see it. When you fly into Bangor, it's very wooded. It's fabulous. You ever get a chance to fly in, like second week of October when all the maples are popping and brilliant. But it's the whole state's a big pine forest. Moose population. So for a long time, I was doing this presentation, and I could say, in all my paddles in the backwoods of Maine, I've seen less than 5 people, and I've seen way more moose than people. And it's still true. I've seen more moose than people. My last trip on the Allagash, we saw 7 or 8 moose, and we saw only 3 other paddlers. I don't know how accurate these counts are today. I know our moose population was plummeting. That seems like it's stabilized and hopefully is climbing back. But the best count I got was that Minnesota has something like 3,500 moose is the count or the estimate, and Maine is like 20 times that many, 65,000 moose. So there are a lot of moose in Maine. Bears, there are a lot of bears in Maine. Minnesota is something like 10 to 15,000. I forget the source where I found that. I remember Googling and hunting around state DNR sites. Maine is something like 25 to 36,000. But here's the thing. I get asked a lot, okay, you guide trips, you've been to the Boundary Waters a bazillion times, what do you do about bears? And I have whole, when I'm leading groups or I'm doing presentations, so food handling and managing your camp, and what do you do if there's a bear in camp, and all those types of things. In Maine, the people I've paddled with, very experienced paddlers, full-time guides, what do they do about bears? They don't do anything. The bears are not a problem there, even though there's a lot more bears. Most of the sites where we're paddling are not as commonly used. And so the bears do not seem to be as habituated to people. They don't associate that campsite, and they don't associate a group of canoeists with a dinner bell. So they're not coming to camp to raid the food. And I think the bears are also, it's a big hunting culture. I think they're hunted pretty hard throughout the state there. So there might be a little of that too, or they're a little more scared and spooked by people. But I definitely think a lot of it has to do with, it's not like, Lake 1, 2, 3 in the Boundary Waters where they know every single night there's going to be a group of campers there, frying bacon in the morning and, leaving food scraps all over the place. So. Yes. Okay. So I need to change this slide. I have encountered a few people now on Maine rivers, but I've also, no bears. So great time. A few slides you can see up there in the Northeast, just the cover versus Minnesota. So very woodsy up there. The night sky, we have definitely dark spot in northern Minnesota. Thankfully, that's wonderful. One of the interesting things, you can kind of see it from this slide, the northwest corner of Maine is the North Maine woods. And it is an area that is about 3.5 million acres, which incidentally is about the same size as Superior National Forest, maybe a little larger. So it's about the same size as our wonderful Superior National Forest in northeast Minnesota. But in the North Maine woods, there's no official settlement. There's no incorporated townships or cities. A lot of it is private timber company land, and it is logged. It is for commercial purposes, but there's a long-standing tradition of allowing recreationalists to canoe, camp, hunt, fish in the North Maine woods. So it's a very wild area. And I know I talked to a lot of people from around here, and they're like, "Oh, it's logged. That's terrible. That's not wilderness." I'll say is, I think you should go there and experience it. It is a huge area, and there's I find it very beautiful, and it's very wild, very remote, and maybe it's adjusting the mindset a little bit. And to me, it's just part of the culture, and it's partially interesting. When you're driving up to the Allagash and you're going up on the dirt road, bounce along for an hour, and you see the logging truck coming the other way. It's part of the culture, and there's interesting old logging trains and things like that you'll encounter in the woods, and so it's definitely part of the culture. Oh, here's a map that shows a little bit better. So that whole northwestern part, and that's really from what's Baxter State Park and Millinocket up northwest is nothing. So it's great. There is a lot of there is plenty of opportunity though, other than camping in a tent. There's a lot of what they would call camps, cabins or lodges, we would call them, traditional hunting and fishing camps, recreational camps where you can go in and rent a cabin and stay and visit. So, the culture. So, I think one of the things that people talk a lot about when they talk about travel in general is culture and meeting different people in different places. And I'd say one of the things I like about Maine is it feels like I went someplace different. There's some pretty strong accents there. There's some funny phrases and different terms, and what I found is there's sort of like this parallel cast of characters in the outdoorsy group there. It's fun to meet those people, but it feels like you're really traveling abroad with the heavy Maine accent. And what I have a picture there is one of my absolute favorites. Every time, first time I get in Maine, and my last meal out is I love a good lobster roll, and they're everywhere and they're delicious. So maybe a couple of trips. I'll give a kind of quick tour through, and then share some things. This was my first trip. It was river guide training with Jack Mountain Bushcraft, and we spent a lot of time on the Aroostook River, which is far north part of the county near Masardis, Maine. That's Tim Smith. He's a buddy of mine. He runs Jack Mountain Bushcraft. That's what he's been doing full time for over 20 years. Right now, he's in the woods guiding winter camping trips. And he really does things in the traditional style. And that is absolutely one of the things I've noticed is in Maine, it seems like there's a stronger tie to traditional style. You see more wool, canvas, wood, leather, less synthetics, plastics, composites, more campfires, more axes, less camp stoves and freeze-dried food packets. And for whatever reason, culturally, that seems to be held on to and valued more highly there, sort of the traditional style and way of going about things. And so you can see Tim here, he is solo, he is poling. That's one of the things I said I wanted to go to learn. And that was when I first learned from Tim. He has probably a 12-foot long spruce pole, and he can effectively handle that. Is a 20-foot long wood canvas canoe that probably weighs minimum of 100 pounds. But it's no problem for him to move that upriver, downriver, no shuttle needed. I'll probably be referencing canoe poling a few times. I have a blog post on my website, bullmoosepatrol.com, canoe poling, what's it all about, where I talk more on there. And I think I also have one of my pack and paddle radio episodes is on the blog as well. So if you're interested in hearing more about there, but very fun. Periodically, I take people out and teach classes and guide trips on that. But so great time with Tim. Here we are working on the Aroostook. There's a couple of people dripping wet with getting their sea legs and figuring it all out. Talking about the traditional skills, campfire cooking is highly prized. So the main guides that I know, most of them take a lot of pride in being able to cook and cook well and cook fresh food and to bake and to have hot baked items at breakfast and at dinner. And that's a big part of it when you're guiding a trip. It's more of like a hospitality type thing. And I've seen a lot of them sort of sneer or, with disdain talk about freeze-dried food, and it's just not what they want to do. And so the art and skill of, sourcing wood and being able to manage a fire and to be able to bake, and that's a reflector oven. Quite a few people, the guides still use reflector ovens, and I tell you, it is fantastic. And I've become a huge fan. I take reflector ovens on all the trips where it's practical with me at this point, because what a treat on a cool, frosty morning to have hot cinnamon rolls or blueberry muffins, and to have chocolate cake or strawberry shortcake at night. And it works very well. It's the main trick is like in this picture, having a nice, tall, bright fire that's casting a lot of radiant heat. It doesn't work in front of coals, like you might think of you're baking with a Dutch oven or something along those lines. So here I am using a draw horse to carve an axe handle. I guess just some of the traditional skills. Baxter State Park, I think, is worth a mention. I don't know how many people in this, I should have asked, how many people in this group have been to Maine and where you've been. A lot of the tourism's centered around Acadia National Park and the coastline. Incredible beauty, fantastic area, somewhat similar to our North Shore. Baxter State Park, you hear quite a bit about. Having visited, it's interesting learning about the history. Baxter State Park is huge, and I think I love our state parks. The chain of state parks going up the North Shore, just a real treasure here. The Baxter State Park in Maine is, I'd say it's a little different. It's a little more rugged. It's not as well maintained, and it's actually by its mandate forever wild as part of the mandate. So it's not supposed to be as manicured and groomed and sort of having modern conveniences as you might find in other states' state parks. And it has a unique structure separate from other parks where it's Percival Baxter was the governor of Maine, and he was a wealthy shipping magnate, and he donated this land, which contains Mount Katahdin, and it's managed by like the state of Maine legislature, the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and then the Baxter State Park Commission or something. So it's like a tri-power that governs the park, but very beautiful area and lots of recreation right there in Baxter State Park. And that's really sort of the gateway to the North Woods from there. So there I am on a hike and some beautiful lakes in the state park. So great spot to visit if you have a short time and you want to feel for what North Maine Woods is like. I think Baxter State Park is a great stop. And especially if, like me, if you've been reading L.L. Bean catalogs, for the last several decades, you got to see it because it's all over their catalog. So anyway, I took that trip and I loved it. I thought it was fantastic and I wanted to go back. And one of the things that I learned more about there, as I was mentioned with Fly Rod Crosby, was the state's Registered Maine Guide program. And at one point, it kind of dawned on me. I said, well, do you have to be a resident? And they said, no, you don't have to be a resident. We have people from out of state who come here and guide. And I blame the Boy Scouts. It's the old Boy Scouts on me. I'm super hardwired to chase patches and ranks and tick off things like that. It's just, I don't know why. It's just the thing in me. And so I spent the winter trying to learn what I could. How do I take this exam? What's on the test? How hard is it? And I'd had a lot of outdoor training and personal experience before that and some really good experiences. And one of the things I found is they keep it somewhat nebulous on purpose. So you need to know first aid. You need to know navigation very, very well. And there's separate tests. There's a hunting exam, fishing exam, there's recreation, there's whitewater rafting and sea kayaking, and they have slightly different tests, but they all have a general written test on general outdoor skills. I think everyone in this group, if you're an avid outdoors person, you probably pass that without much difficulty, the written exam. But then after you pass that, you have to have your date applied for, and then you go for the oral exam. And this, I've come to believe, is really just a screening to weed out people that they do not want representing the state of Maine. So you show up, and it is a conservation officer and a master Maine guide. And they'll start off and say, oh, Scott, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, and why do you want to be a Maine guide, and what activities do you like doing? And it starts kind of pleasant. And then they start saying, well, what about this? And what about that? And they hold up a clipping off an evergreen. And what is that? Is that a fir or is that a spruce? Okay, is that a black spruce or white spruce? Or is that a pine? What would that be used for? What kind of feather is this? What kind of duck feather is it? Things like that. And they just take it anywhere they want. And they're trying to stress test you and see how you perform. And the real hallmark of the Maine guide test is what they call the lost person scenario, which is a role play that they put you into. And it's a no-win situation. No matter what you say in this role play, it keeps getting worse and worse. And I think they're trying to gauge how you react under pressure and also, get some sense of your decision-making and your experience and your training. And so they keep it at about a 50% pass rate. And I think it's just, they don't want to have really easily identifiable yes, no, ABC type questions. They want to keep it and say, who do we want to wear the patch? So I was very intrigued by this, and I wanted to do some more rivers there as I heard more. I went back the next year and did the East Branch of the Penobscot and did a river guide training course with a fellow named Kevin Slater, who I'd met. He had actually come to Minnesota and spoke at our winter camping symposium. He's a musher. He runs dog sled trips in the winter through his Mahoosic guide service, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for that type of experience. I actually went 2 different years. I did his winter guide training and his river guide training, which were both designed to teach the skills of outdoor leadership and the hands-on in the field skills. So the East Branch of the Penobscot is regarded as one of the most technical rivers in Maine for a canoeist. There's bigger ones that are like raft only or kayak only, but this is about the upper end of open canoe type paddling, and it was just a beautiful trip. And it's a historic trip. Henry David Thoreau paddled that. It's mentioned other old outdoor writing. And here's one of the things I think is interesting. I grew up going to the outdoor shows here, and like Cliff Jacobson is one of my mentors. I've read everything he's written. I've seen all of his talks. I was so delighted about 15 years ago when I connected with him through Scouts. Finally, my hero, and we worked together running Expedition Canoeing School for several years. And so I grew up hearing his stories, and Bob O'Hara and Rob Kesselring and a number of these people who've done a lot of big Arctic trips around here. And their trips tend to start off with, well, we got in the van and we drove for 15 hours up to the end of the road, and then we got in a bush pilot plane. We flew into the bush, and going on these trips in Maine, like the East Branch of the Penobscot or the Machias, you get on a commercial flight, at least is the way I do it, and you fly right into Bangor International Airport. It's not that far of a flight. The tickets are not that expensive. You get off the airport and you meet your crew in the morning, and you drive about an hour in the van, maybe 2, and you're on the river, and that's it. These are very accessible trips. Now, they might not be quite as wild or quite as remote as going way up into far northwest Ontario or northern Saskatchewan. But like I said, I've seen very, very few people, and I've had wonderful experiences. So I think that's one of the things that's interesting to me about going on these trips in Maine is pretty accessible, really, in terms of getting there. The logistics are quite easy. Now, I know this is one of the big differences I've noticed, and one of the differences I've talked about is the Midwest. There's is something about Midwestern folks. It's a do-it-yourself culture. It's a DIY. And most of my friends who are real serious boundary waters paddlers or canoeists, they would not dream of hiring a guide. That would be an embarrassment to them. They could never even fathom, like, you would spend money on that? Why would you do that? And so I know people from Minnesota Canoe Association. I just had a nice dinner after the Midwest event in the fall with the Friends of Wabakimi, and hearing about their trips, and they've all done great trips. And I like doing that type of thing too. But it's very much a do-it-yourselfer type culture. On the trips I've gone on in Maine, I've met some very experienced paddlers, some very seasoned paddlers who go back year after year and hire the same guide. And they don't view it as a lesser. They view it as like an additive. They want to go with that guide because they want to learn from them. They like the way they run the trip. They like the experience, or maybe they just want the convenience. And for me, that's what made this logistically possible on some of these trips. Is I'd show up with my Duluth pack with my sleeping bag and my clothes in it, my PFD, and that's that. I knew that they'd be there with the canoes and the food and have everything worked out. And so the logistics can be really good. And I'll show some photos in a bit. There's a local fellow, some of you may have know Dave Burkhart, very nice guy. I've paddled with him a lot. He's done some of the bigger Arctic trips with some of the Minnesota crew, and he came out and did the Allagash with me. And I asked him at the end as we're off, I said, well, Dave, what'd you think? How was it compared to going up and doing the Hood River and some of these incredible Arctic rivers? And he just smiled. He said, well, my advice would be go with the guide. He loved it. We were talking about, he said, it's like a floating bed and breakfast. It's a fun experience. So anyway, back to the East Branch. This is a great trip. If anyone is looking for something more wild, a wilderness canoe camping experience where there's some whitewater, some challenge, but something that's, like I say, accessible, not too remote, this is one to look at. Class 1 to 3, there's several waterfalls on it. There's lots of nice rapids. The elevation, so the elevation doesn't just help with the rivers and the current. it's fun when you're paddling and you see Mount Katahdin or the Traveler Range in the distance. You get some great views. So here's a scene. This is the East Branch of the Penobscot. This is not my photo. These photos are much better. So I put some of these in from the Portland Press, but you can see there in the fog, this is what it looks like as you're going down the Penobscot. And this is Grand Pitch. So pitch is a term you want to be aware of that connotes waterfall in Maine. If you hear pitches, you hear the term falls. Falls are often assigned to what we would call rapids. So often you can run something called the falls, but if you see pitch, you don't run that. That's a carry. And we don't portage in Maine, you carry. That's the carry. It's not the portage trail. So here we have the big argument. Is it portage or portage if you're north of the border? In the Northeast, they're carries for whatever reason. So another view. I can talk about the elevation, Haskell Rock pitch. So I thought this was kind of fun. Here's a poem from 1902 from the logging era, The Night of the Spike-Soled Boots. And it's about the hulling machine. So the hulling machine is the name of a set of rapids on the East Branch of the Penobscot River. It's talking about the tenderfoot is a fool, and the man's new to the birch bark canoe. They had told me to carry a mile above, but he doesn't. The poem goes on, and he meets his demise going through the hulling machine rapids, and should have listened and taken out the carry. So Stair Falls. So here we're looking at falls, not what we'd think of as falls, but what they call falls. And that's a fun one to run. So there's lots of nice sets of rapids. There's good camping. There's no permits, no fees. It's state of Maine, wild land. Those are one of the things I find interesting. In many of these areas, you're doing the rivers in Maine, the land is either timber company land or it's state of Maine, and it's just sort of free use. There's campsites, it's less sort of defined and regulated, and it's just not nearly as heavily used. So, another good view of the drop there. Traveler Mountains, this is one of my photos. So just a great trip. There again, here we are, bigger group, campfire cooking. You can see the one fellow sitting on the wooden box. That's a wanigan. So portaging is one of the significant differences in canoe camping between Maine and Minnesota. No one is better, in my experience, at portaging than Minnesotans or Boundary Waters paddlers. We have it dialed in. So the Boundary Waters paddlers know how to pack very efficiently and to get over those portage trails quickly. And, two people in a canoe, two packs, one person takes the light pack in the canoe, the other person takes the heavy pack and the paddles, and boom, you're up and over the trail and back into the water. So we've really got it down in terms of packing light and very efficiently. The Mainers do some things really well. They're great paddlers generally, and they do a lot of things well, but the portaging is kind of a nightmare. It's like a yard sale. There's lots of small packs. They like the wanigans, the wooden box that you carry with a leather tump line over your head and just the box on your back. It's actually not that bad for short portages. I don't mind it. I kind of like them. They're very handy in camp. It's a nice way to organize your cooking gear and your pots and pans. You can sit on them. You can use them as a cutting board. I like the aesthetic of the wooden traditional wanigan more than the blue barrel. And as one of my friends in Maine says, oh, those blue barrels, you're digging in there like a raccoon in a trash can trying to find your food. And it's kind of true. You're always sifting to the bottom. A lot of people still use pack baskets in Maine. I love the pack baskets. I use them when appropriate. I think they look beautiful. They're nice for carrying things like lanterns and hard-sided objects. And so I've taken some of these things for the different types of trips, but they tend to have more smaller gear, which in part, if you're paddling rapids, especially if you're going solo, it's nice to be able to adjust your trim. And sometimes, especially poling down rapids, you want to be downstream heavy. And so the smaller packs allow for a little bit more trim adjustment, maybe a little more easily than just a couple big Mongo Minnesota style packs. But anyway, it's another example of kind of a classic camp there. The fellow with the green pants who's kind of bent over, you can see he's standing under the rain fly there. That is a canoe pole. If you look down into the ground, you can actually see the metal tip or the shoe of the pole in the ground. So the poles are not just handy on the river. They're excellent to have a couple around camp. They make it really easy to set up a nice, high, tight rain fly. And yeah, I think I mentioned, fresh food is highly prized, and I'm I I love to eat, number one, but number two, I'm kind of a pragmatist, and so I'm not going to go nuts and carry a bunch of heavy food on a Boundary Waters trip with 30 portages or something like that. But where possible, if I'm doing trips on the Cloquet or the Flambeau or the Mississippi or ones like that where there's not as many portages, the campfire cooking is a lot of fun. There's definitely an art to it, and there's maybe a little bit of showmanship, and eating real solid fresh food is a real treat on a trip. So a couple more photos from the East Branch. There we are, lining canoes. You can see in that green canoe in the end there's a full-size hard-sided cooler, and that's pretty common. A lot of people take those. This trip probably had 3 really pretty significant carries, portages. So not that many, but fairly challenging. But still, the guy leading the trip packed in a hard side cooler. And I told him, I said, you got to see these soft side backpack coolers like we have in Minnesota. Like Cook Custom Sewing or Condos makes. They work great. They keep the food cold, and they're a lot more comfortable to carry than using a tump line carrying a big 100-pound cooler on your back. But it does allow for good eating. So there's me and Bud, my paddle partner on that trip. So there's Kevin Slater. He's the one who I did that trip with, and you can see here he's got the wooden Wanigan with the leather tump line. You can maybe make out a little bit there coiled in, and he's got a spruce setting pole, and give a little demo there. So that's a very classic Maine scene. Maybe the other thing to point out here, if we're comparing and contrasting, so I do probably 3/4 of my paddling solo. I love paddling solo. I like the freedom and independence. Yes, I enjoy having someone in the bow going through rapids. It's a fun teamwork, and it's fun training someone, but it's really fun paddling solo. And people say, well, what solo canoe do you use? I say, I use my canoe. And that's very much the Maine type mentality. So there is a lot of solo paddling in Maine, but it's typically done with just traditional tandem full-size canoe versus, it seems to me in Minnesota, when you hear someone talk about paddling solo, they are referring to a sort of a downsized, scaled down, purely dedicated solo canoe that's shorter and narrower, and the paddling is done in the middle, often switching sides. And so but I enjoy it, and I think it works very well, especially if you can use the pole. The full-size tandem canoe works very, very well for paddling solo. So anyway, after that trip, I went to Augusta. I went to the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and I took the test and I passed and I got the patch. So that was an exciting moment for me on that trip. A really fun event to point out, the Maine Canoe Symposium. So I've mentioned some of our great outdoor shows that we have in this region that I've learned so much from and met a great group of friends. Canoe Copia down in Madison, and Midwest Mountaineering hosts these great fall and spring outdoor expos. There's an event in I believe it's early June in Maine called the Maine Canoe Symposium. And what's different about it is it's actually done at a camp on a lake on Moose Pond. That's the difference too. You'll hear a lot of what we would definitely refer to as lakes called ponds in Maine. So you can see the elevation there at the mountains, but you camp or you stay in wall tents or in cabins there, and they have hands-on workshop. And it's a really fantastic learning experience. It's a fun way to meet people. They have great hands-on paddling demos. So here's a couple that races canoes, and they're very much showing what I would consider a Minnesota style. Bent shafts, carbon fiber paddles, sit and switch paddling where you're flipping sides, but that's not nearly as common as the more traditional side. Canoes sailing, here's another racer. So this is something in the article that came up, is just the standing up in canoes. So we talked a bit about using the pole to stand up, but standing up and paddling. So that's a full-size Old Town Tripper, a 17-foot canoe. And the fellow standing up was doing a whole presentation on stand-up paddling. And I remember he had the line like, why don't I have a paddle board? Well, I'm too cheap. I just stand up and use my canoe. And that's basically it once you give it a chance. In fact, standing up and paddling a canoe to me is easier than a stand-up paddle board. I do it all the time. Honestly, you just need a longer paddle and a little bit of courage to stand up and get your feel and get your feet in the chines of the canoe and bend your legs, maybe drop your seat back a little bit more for some balance. but it works very well. It's a nice way to kind of mix it up. So a lot of standing in the canoes. In fact, one of the things I wanted to show you is, regional difference. This might be, an example of what we're all used to. So a very classic canoe paddle. This is 60 inches long. This is made out of spruce. It's fairly light. It's beautiful wood. I like wood paddles. Kind of just your classic canoe paddle. And we see a lot of these, and a lot of the canoe gurus around here talk about lightness and efficiency. Minnesotans are obsessed with efficiency. Anytime something comes up canoeing, well, that's not as efficient, and vertical paddle shaft, and should it be a 15-degree bend or a 12-degree bend, or this or that, in the paddle. And I can't, I just sort of scratch my head. Whenever a canoe comes up, I can't believe how many times I get asked in this area here, the first question about a canoe: what does it weigh? How much does it weigh? It's a canoe, it's a boat. But that is the first thing. We are obsessed with weight in canoes. Why? Well, because we love to go up to the boundary bars, love to go to Quetico, and you spend half your time marching between the lakes with that canoe on your shoulders. No one talks about what canoes weigh in Maine. They don't care. The first question, they look at a canoe: that's a beautiful canoe. How does it paddle? How does it paddle? How does she paddle? How does it track? How does it turn? How does it pull? It's dynamics in the water. But the paddles, there's a traditional paddle that doesn't work all the time, but I have fallen in love with. These are two examples. First of all, you see how much longer they are. Yeah, they're not even in the screen, but these are both, as opposed to for me, I'm a tall guy. I'm 6'5". This is the paddle that would fit me. This is a 60-inch paddle. So 5 feet long. These are classic Maine guide paddles, and they are both 6 feet long, so 72 inches, and they're a little short for me, actually. But you can see the idea is they're meant to be used either sitting or standing. And so this type of grip is common in the Northeast, where it's a very elongated grip, as opposed to this. So this, your hand position is here. With the Maine guide grip, yes, you can grip here. Or if you're sitting and you need to choke up, that's made to side handle the paddle. And it's really fun. I like it. It's less pressure on the wrist and the shoulders. And it lets you change up and vary your grip from here to here. And if you're standing, you can grip here and you have a very long paddle, or you can choke up and sit down and paddle here. And there's a whole stroke. Some of you are familiar with the term of the J stroke. They have some regional variations that they call the Maine guide stroke or the North wood stroke, which is kind of a leaning, rocking motion, but it has that where you knife the paddle blade back and lift the paddle blade for that correction. So definitely some differences in the style. This is a fellow named David Lewis. He's an architect in Maine. He apprenticed when he was young for the Conovers. If anyone's read The Snowwalker's Companion, they were a husband-wife team who ran very traditional winter camping trips and canoe trips. And David does a wonderful presentation really showing what I think is just, such a beautiful set of classic canoe camping gear. There you can see his wooden canvas canoe built off the EM white pattern. He has a Wanigan in there. He does have a Duluth pack. He's holding the Maine guide style paddle. So very elegant, classy style. And here's a demo and polling. So Maine Canoe Symposium. If you're going to work in a trip and you're looking to have maybe a little bit of learning and interaction and learn more about the culture, I'd say that would be a great one to mark in your calendar and think about Maine Canoe Symposium and then work in maybe a trip around that. I'll just maybe show a few highlights of a couple other trips quickly, because I know we're probably getting on in time. The Machias River is another one that's very accessible. This one is wild. You need to be a strong whitewater paddler, but it's a week-long trip. This was one of my favorite canoe trips I've ever done anywhere. It was featured on one of the old PBS Any Place Wild shows with John Veman. And it's just a wonderful trip. So, here I am pulling down some of the rapids. This was a big breakthrough trip for me. It was a week-long trip, and I went with a guy and I said, hey, I really want to get a lot of time with the pole and try and develop that. And so for the whole week, I, as much as I could, was standing. We went solo, but you can see we're solo and full-size tandem canoes. And with the pole, though, I mean, this may look a little crazy or reckless. It's not. What you're not seeing is the canoe's going pretty slowly, and you have great control. You can stop with that pull and hold yourself and spot. It's kind of like playing Tetris with canoe. You can back up, you can slide over, you can move around. A little bit of balance. Let's say this was relatively new to me. I'm not a downhill skier. Skateboards scare me to death. I'm maybe a little top heavy. So, I mean, if I can do this, a lot of people can do this, but just a wonderful trip. So a lot of the rivers, that kind of reminds me of like the Brule, maybe the Flambeau, a little bit of that rich tannin in the water, kind of root beer color. And this trip, we saw 0 people the entire trip. It was just fantastic. 5 days on the river, just wonderful time. So there you see kind of getting classic solo paddling. And so here it is. So I've been pulling a canoe now for about 10 years. I do it all the time locally. I lead trips. I do on the Brule. I do on everything. And here's my one swim. So this was a step out. I was right about here, and that side current hit my bow, and I lost my focus for a second. I think I lost my nerve, and next thing I knew, there I was, boom, in the water. But canoe stayed upright, and it was no harm, and that was that. So maybe touch on a couple other ones, because the East Branch of the Penobscot, the Machias, those are a little bit more aggressive. Sort of the some of the big classics in Maine, without a doubt, the Allagash Wilderness Waterway is the classic Maine canoe trip. That's the most common, it's the most popular. It's roughly a 100-mile trip that flows north. There's an incredible amount of logging history. It's a very beautiful trip. You have large lakes at the headwater area. First couple of days, I mean, it feels like you're in Quetico or Boundary Waters going through lake type country, and then it narrows into a river. Parallel to that is the St. John, and this is up in that North Maine woods area. The St. John is a very wild, remote river that's really only runnable in the spring with spring rains and snow melt, and it ends in some very big rapids. But then they also have a St. Croix. Like we have the St. Croix on the border with Wisconsin. In Maine, there's a St. Croix on the border of New Brunswick. And by all accounts, I actually haven't paddled that one. It's a very beautiful trip. Lots of rapids, but they're said to be not intimidating, just kind of fun, splashy type rapids. So Allagash was established by the Maine legislature in 1966. In 1970, became a national wild and scenic river up to class 2. You can do 4 to 10-day trip. I put together a trip in 2017. We did the second week in October, and it was just beautiful. It was fantastic. And interestingly, it's a long enough trip, and it's heading north, so that as we're hitting it kind of mid-October, the leaves were turning more and we're heading north, and it felt significantly different, whereas we're seeing a lot of maples and bright leaves early in the trip. By the time we got to the end of the trip, it was just tall, spindly spruce trees. It felt very, very up northy. So I was kind of flipped through a few photos of the Allagash. A lot of this may look kind of familiar, but here again, campfire cooking. That's Chip and Lanny Cochran. Chip is a 3rd-generation Allagash guide. His grandpa started guiding on the Allagash in the 40s. And Chip has done something, it's over 150. I think when we did this with him like 5 years ago, that was a 150th trip. He might be up to 200 now. That would be like saying you've done 150 week-long Boundary Waters trips. But we had a group of 15, a big group. He cooked every meal over the campfire, rain or shine, and we had a lot of rain. We had cold temperatures, and this is not like little piecemeal, like here you go, here's a hot dog for you. These were beautifully cooked meals. Come and get it. They're all set, and they say fresh, hot baked goods every meal. He's really the most incredible display of campfire cooking I've ever seen. So here's some of the old logging stuff. You can hike into the woods in different points and find old steam engines and things like that that were part of the logging industry. So I put this photo in to be a little bit mean, maybe. So we were canoeing. It was cold. It was late in the season. The water was low. We had no problem using the canoes and poles. We were floating high with our week's worth of gear. The only people we saw on this entire trip, and I do think the Allagash gets more use midsummer. It's more popular in the middle of the summer. It was this group of 3 kayakers that we're kind of leapfrogging with as we went along the Allagash. And I don't know, those poor folks didn't look like they're having as much fun to me. They didn't have nearly as much. They weren't eating like we were. They had to pack like backpackers to fit everything into their kayaks. and they're wearing wetsuits and dry suits because the water's cold, and they're sitting on their tail down in the water, and it's shallow, and their paddles are catching rocks, and they're having to, work their way out of their kayaks to get out of the shallows because they couldn't see as well sitting down low. And so I think it's great. I love paddling. I think people should get out and enjoy it however they want, but I couldn't help but point out that I think canoes are better. So especially for this kind of trip. So some of these scenes were just, just picture perfect. Everything you'd picture in like the Northwoods Getaway, the classic type picture. So this is just kind of some data points. A few more. Spencer Stream, Dead Rivers, another trip. Spencer Stream is famous Revolutionary War. Rogers Rangers went up the trip here, stand up paddling coming down. That's a good view of the main guide paddle with that long grip. And it's amazing. So, like I say, it may seem a little riskier. In some ways, it's not. With that pole, it also is kind of like a balance beam. So you have a lot of weight. You can touch the shore. You can touch the bottom to brace yourself. And even with the long paddle like that, you have so much more reach and leverage. If you're going to do a cross bow maneuver, you're not confined by what your waist and hips can do and getting, a little bit of reach. You can reach way over a much longer stroke or a draw. You can really lean into it. So you can get a lot of power. I guess here's another picture of campfire cooking, set up on the Wanigans, fresh baked rolls from scratch, all fantastic. There, so that fellow holding the paddle is Dan Pelletier, just a great guy. But look at the size of that paddle. Dan's probably 6 feet tall, and the blade and grip are just enormous. Dan is an incredibly experienced paddler. Most Minnesotans I know would just choke at the thought of paddling with that paddle. Dan has paddled solo the Yukon River, and he did it in a 20-foot XL tripper canoe with a paddle like that. So it's not that he doesn't know what he's doing. He's a very experienced paddler. It's just some of the regional style differences. So this is me on that winter guide training, Lake Umbagog National Wildlife Refuge, which is right on the border with New Hampshire. Wonderful lake area if you're interested in paddling there, and had a great winter trip. The wood canvas canoes I mentioned, huge culture there. In the southeast part of the state, there's the Grand Lake Stream, a lot of cottages or camps as they'd call them there, and big fishing culture, but they're limited to 10 horsepower. And so a lot of them, these Grand Lake Stream canoes with the square stern, hand-built wood canvas canoes, just absolutely beautiful. You'll see them running around, not the big high-powered fishing boats with, logos all over, and that looks like a NASCAR event. The culture is just really, really neat in this area where they've kept this sort of old style. So even where they're using motorboats here, it's a really classy approach, if you ask me. So anyway, I've been talking for a while. I know there is a time. I don't know how we're doing on time. Do we have time for some questions or?
Yeah, let's open things up for questions.
Questions or comments? Maybe I will throw out, if anyone's composing a question or thinking about it, is I do have a blog, a website, bullmoosepatrol.com, and I've got a lot of this stuff on here. So a lot of articles about canoe camping, almost all my radio episodes are on there. Webinars with the Minnesota Rovers about winter camping are posted on there. So a lot of these things are on the site. And I'm probably most active actually on Facebook. There's a Bull Moose Patrol Facebook page. So if any of you are on there, I invite you to join and follow along there. That's probably where I'm most active, because it's easiest for me as I'm sitting there eating my lunch and wanting a little daydream break from doing my day job to think about canoeing or winter camping or something like that. And if you send an email to bullmoosepatrol@gmail.com, put you on the email list. I'm not going to spam you, but you'll get updates about trips and classes. Ran a series of classes on wilderness survival skills at Warrego Nature Center up in Lino Lakes. I see Eric from Warrego is on the call here. So Eric's helped me out a lot, did a great job with helping me organize this. And we're getting ready to map out that sequence again of classes on navigation, first aid, knots, fire, knife and axe use, emergency shelters. And we were doing that the second Thursday of every month at Wargo, which is just a wonderful facility there. So if you send me an email, we can get you on the list and give you updates about that. So let's see. Question: what's the basic cost for the Allagash trip without travel to get there? So I'd say it depends. You could do it completely self-outfitted. You know, if you want to drive out there with your own canoe, your own gear, your own food, you could do it very cheaply. But of course, you'd have time and travel cost embedded in that. There are some costs that you pay to the North Maine woods, like an access fee. I forget what it is. It's not all that much. I want to say it's like less than $100 for a week or something like that to have that North Maine woods access fee. Now, if you use a guide, there's a range. The guiding operations tend to be much smaller in Maine. They're what I'd call like mom and pop operations. A lot of people have been doing this for a long time. When you think of guides in the boundary waters, in my experience, they are typically people who are often young, maybe college students during their summer, and they're often affiliated with like the YMCA camp or the Scouts. That's great. The guides in Maine often are middle-aged and older. They're often multi-generational, and it's sort of a cottage industry where this is something that they do part-time. But for a fully guided trip where they're providing the gear and the food and the equipment and the shuttles, and often it's their van where they're driving you up there, I would say for like a week-long trip, you're probably looking at like $1,000, give or take. Okay, I see a Charles Summers patch on the shelf. When did you guide there? So Summers is the Northern Tier High Adventure base outside of Ely on Moose Lake in the Boundary Waters, and it's one of the Boy Scouts of America's national high adventure bases. And Northern Tier actually has a base there on Moose Lake outside of Ely, and they have one in Atikokan, and they have an outpost in Bissett, Manitoba, where thousands of scouts from all over the world really come and go on canoe camping trips in Boundary Waters, Quetico, and into Manitoba. And then my main role in that is I helped run their winter camping program, their cold weather leader school. And so I was a volunteer instructor for that for about 5 winters, where I'd go up for that program, and did that over the last 10 years. So still involved per the Alumni Association. I think it's a wonderful program, and but it had a long affiliation with Scouts, grew up in it and involved in the council, and now a Cub Scout dad to a 7-year-old here. So maybe I'd ask of the attendees, has anyone been to Maine? Anyone done a canoe trip? Did I miss anything? Was I anything else to add?
Say, Scott, there is a chat here. Are there canoe experiences in Baxter? Are the canoe experiences in Baxter compared to Katahdin? I guess maybe she's asking how they compare.
So Baxter State Park has a few big lakes in it, and so you can go to Baxter State Park, and wonderful hiking. Climbing out Mount Katahdin is one of that's sort of a pinnacle experience. But I mean, it is. That's one of the main things to do there. But there are some nice lakes where you can rent canoes and kayaks and paddle around. But it's not Baxter State Park itself is not where you would do like an extended canoe trip. It'd be more of like day paddling around these lakes in the park. But that area, let's see, I'm struggling to recall here. Grand Lake Matagamon is right there. And if you go northwest out of Baxter State Park, that is the beginning of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. And if you go southeast out of there, that is the Penobscot River chain. So we can do the West Branch, which is more mild, very beautiful, but a more mild paddle. or the East Branch that I showed some photos of that has more of the whitewater and is probably a bit more rugged trip. And something I didn't mention because it came after this, there was a big debate, and the East Branch of the Penobscot is now a national monument. So while it was just a river that, you know, was there and people camped and canoed on it, and I've seen, you know, Henry David Thoreau did, but it did not have any particular special designation. Roxanne Quimby, who was Burt's Bees owner, you know, the chapstick, and she's from Maine, and she was in love with that area, and it was her dream to make that a national park. And she wanted to buy up the land and donate it as a national park. And this was a fairly contentious affair. And in reading it, it's fairly similar to the history of like Voyageurs National Park and the Boundary Waters, where oftentimes the locals don't necessarily love this idea of it becoming a national or federal protected area. And there's a bit of fight and back and forth. And a lot of the locals felt that, I guess, Quimby was maybe a bit heavy-handed in her approach. She was just going to write checks and buy up all this land and make people offers they couldn't refuse and then turn it over to the National Park Service. And I guess her son came along. His name was Lucas, and I guess he did a lot of sort of town hall meetings and listening and built some bridges, and they came to a nice compromise with it being a national monument. So it does have some national protected status. And so that's right next to Baxter State Park is the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. It's a pretty cool thing, which contains that East Branch of the Penobscot.
I was going to weigh in on the portage versus portage debate, at least with one experience of it. My name's Yana, and I spent one summer working at Grand Portage National Monument in Minnesota, and was a volunteer interpreter and guide. And it was interesting because we were always taught that if you're referring to the village or the national monument, it was always pronounced Grand Portage. But if you were referring to the actual overland transport route that the voyageurs used and the Anishinaabe before them, you always were to pronounce it Grand Portage, the French pronunciation, which is fine, you know, not hard to learn. But there is a punchline to this story because I'm a writer, and I actually wrote a poem about my experiences up there, and I use both pronunciations in the poem because at one point I'm referring to the place, and in another place I'm referring to the portage. And the poem doesn't sound right if you don't say portage, so I always have to explain it every time I read it.
Interesting. Well, I know it's debated. I always thought it was maybe Canadians and the French roots and being a little more classy, saying portage versus us Americans.
Yeah, well, you know, it does sound classy, but then you have to remember the voyageurs were, you know, rabble rousers. And one of the other things we were taught at Grand Portage is when tourists looked at the stockade built around the trading post with the spiky tops, you know, people love to ask, oh, was that built to keep out Indians? And we were taught always to say that the native people were people who were traded with, they were welcome there, they were welcome in the Great Hall. The stockade was built to keep out the voyageurs.
Wow. Yeah.
I have a question. In your interaction with the Maines, do you ever talk about there's a debate about who owns Paul Bunyan?
Oh, yeah.
Like they claim that Paul Bunyan started there, and we claim it started in Minnesota. So I know this isn't related to the canoeing, but I thought it'd be kind of interesting if they have
Well, I think so. I have a photo, and it's from yeah, right there in Bangor, Bangor, as I say, Bangor, you would probably say, there's a huge Paul Bunyan statue. And if you stay at the hotel with the casino, which is not a bad place to stay at all, there's not too many options. You look right out your window, and there's the big Paul Bunyan statue right there. And my understanding of logging is it basically followed the progression of development from east to west. And so I was so you're bringing to mind a few things. I showed some photos from the Maine Canoe Symposium and talking about a lot of the interesting classes and sharing. And there was a fellow there who was talking about folklore. And I said something, or I brought up something about Paul Bunyan, and he sort of tore into me. He really got upset and said, Paul Bunyan's not folklore. Paul Bunyan is commercialism, and it was advertising propaganda and this and that. Like, oh, it seems like folklore to me. But so anyway, he did not like it and corrected me right away that I had considered Paul Bunyan folklore. But there is Paul Bunyan stuff in Maine. And when I've read up on it, because I thought Paul Bunyan is kind of interesting, I think there is some stories that go back to the French Canadian loggers in Quebec, and that Bunyan was Bunyan or something like that, is kind of named after some person. But a lot of the loggers from Maine, I think quite a few of them, I understand, is they traveled west over time as stuff got cut down. They went from Maine to Vermont to upstate New York, and loggers absolutely went from Michigan to Wisconsin to Minnesota. And then from Minnesota, a lot of them ended up out in the Pacific Northwest. And so one of the things I like with old time historical stuff is logging history and culture and studying axes. And it's different seeing the way the axe heads evolved as they moved west to longer blades for the bigger trees and things like that. And the Cloquet River, running down into Duluth, there is Buzz Ryan campsite, and I think maybe Buzz Ryan Rapids. And there's an interesting 4 or 5 part history of logging in Minnesota, sort of papery things, and they're written by C.R. Ryan, who was a forester and a logger, and that's Buzz Ryan that those rapids are named after in the Cloquet. But he talks a lot about logging in Minnesota and how some of those loggers came from out east to basically follow the jobs and follow the work. So to your question, I suppose you could say both. Maybe Paul Bunyan was from out east, but he came west, as the logging progressed west. So,
Say, Scott, Kath was wondering what do you recommend for a beginner's trip?
Well, I think if you've done Boundary Waters canoe trips, you've paddled in Minnesota, if you like it, you don't have to, but let's say you do that and you say, yeah, I'd like maybe a river experience and maybe a bit different cultural experience. I'd like to see some different things. I think the Allagash is a wonderful, that really is classic Maine canoe trip. And there's a lot of options on the Allagash. There's plenty of different guides that will do trips on that. You can rent canoes and self-outfit out there. So if you wanted to fly out and pack, say, Boundary Water style, kind of light and tight, and just rent a canoe, you could rent a canoe and do a shuttle service. There is one long stretch called Chase Rapids that's 9 miles long that has, it kind of depends on the water level, but up to class 2 rapids. But the Allagash, you start near, you can see Mount Katahdin in the distance. You start, you get that elevation, you paddle through some big lakes, like I said, and then there's river paddling. And as you get further north, as you're going up river, the river gets narrower and narrower. And so it's a nice mix of experiences. And we saw a lot of moose. It's very scenic. There's wonderful campsites. I think that would be a really good first experience. If you want to simplify things, and maybe if you want to learn and want a little coaching on your river paddling and you want to pick up some of the lore and all that, I'd highly recommend going with one of the great guides out there. But it is also absolutely doable on your own, especially if you're an experienced canoe camper. Maybe brush up a little bit on river paddling maneuvers for Chase Rapids, but other than that, it's doable.
Are there any last questions on anybody's minds? Otherwise, you can always email bullmoosepatrol@gmail.com, right?
Absolutely.
Check
Love-
out
love-
the website.
Yeah, love to hear from anyone. So
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Scott.
yeah, thank you.
It was
Oh,
really
I
wonderful.
do see sunrise blueberries and ice cream. Oh yeah, beginner's trip. Yeah, there you go. And it should say maybe just one last thought on that with beginner's trip. The Allagash Wilderness Waterway, most people think of that as like a week-long trip, but you can do shorter segments. It's possible because there's different takeout points where you could say you wanted to fly out there and you wanted to see Acadia and the seashore, and you wanted to see Baxter State Park, and you wanted to sightsee, but you wanted to get in, say, a 3 or 4 day canoe trip. You could do that, and then some people will stretch it into up as much as like a 10-day trip. So it's possible to do a shorter one in there. Yeah. Well, thank you. I enjoyed the time, and I think you guys have a great group, and appreciate the opportunity to come in and chat with y'all.
Well,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thanks very much.
Thank you.
Scott.